Welcome. This presentation is about the human brain. It is around 3 pounds or 1.5 kilograms in weight and is a mass of cells of grey and white color with a consistency something like blancmange. It is said that it has a more complex structure than anything else we know of in the universe. The specific subject is the functioning of the human brain described in a hierarchical fashion, but in doing this, I will also be describing the workings of the brain in terms of how data is processed, and also some speculations on how consciousness works. I will provide some of the history and published scientific evidence in most areas, and I will give details of how I have pieced together different scientific ideas into this hierarchical structure, which is based on my own way of thinking about things. Obviously, this is potentially a huge subject, so this presentation is an overview only, but it contains proposals in the area of consciousness that may be controversial for some people. First, here is the structure of the presentation. I will start with an introduction, give the premises that I am assuming, and an overview of the hierarchical levels. I will then give details of the 3 hierarchical levels that I am proposing. First, the neurons and synapses that are the building blocks of processing within the brain. Second, the structures in the brain that are symbols that represent things in the outside world and within the body and the brain itself. And third, a model of the world, which is the architecture that allows perception, action, thinking, dreaming, and ultimately consciousness. Finally, based on my proposed 3 levels, some speculations on what consciousness is and how it comes about. I have spent much of my spare time over the last 10 years reading books and papers by scientists relating to the workings of the human brain. Of the many themes, theories, and proposals, I have identified 11 different scientific ideas that can be thought of as pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. When these are pieced together, I believe they create a complete and coherent picture of the processing of the human brain that can also lead to an explanation of consciousness. Some of these 11 pieces are areas of well-established scientific facts, some are well-supported theories, and 1 or 2 are slightly lesser-known scientific proposals, but all of them have evidence that supports them, and all of them have been peer-reviewed and published. I have added some new structures in order to join the pieces, and I have included some new ways of looking at things, but I have not contributed any major new ideas to this jigsaw. I have created a separate introduction video that outlines the 11 areas and the conclusion that I reach from them, if you are interested. The brain inside your skull is the result of millions of years of evolution, but compared to the age of the Earth, this is not a long time. To briefly put it into context, the Earth is around 4.5 billion years old, but humans, the Homo genus, appeared only about 2.8 million years ago, which is 99.94% of the age of the Earth. In the light of this, it is perhaps not surprising that the brains that we humans have today are not very much different from the brains of many other mammals, particularly our ape cousins. That is all I will say about these 2 areas, the evolution of the brain, its development in children, and the comparison of human brains to other animals, living and extinct, are all subjects that could be separate full-length presentations, so I am not covering these subjects any further. This slide has 3 statements that are assumed to be true in this presentation. First, my brain is responsible for all my actions. This should not be contentious because the nerve connections between the brain and various parts of the body are very well studied and understood, and when these connections fail because of damage or disease, the results are very clear. There are some minor exceptions for reflex actions that are initiated by cells in the spinal cord rather than the brain. Second, my brain creates all my thoughts, feelings, memories, and consciousness. This might be controversial for some people, especially when talking about consciousness, and even more so if consciousness includes the mind and the soul. Many people feel that their mind, or soul, or even consciousness, is something that is separate from their brain, and I hope to be able to shed some light on why this is the case later in this presentation. We have good evidence that the brain creates our feelings of ownership, identity, agency, free will and consciousness, and therefore also what some people call their mind or soul. The most obvious evidence is the effect of drugs or brain damage on all these aspects, particularly consciousness. Third, that it is possible for a human brain to understand its own workings. This has been debated, but there doesn't seem to be any solid evidence against it, but if I didn't accept it I wouldn't be doing this presentation. We move on to an introduction to the hierarchical levels I am going to be talking about. We need to clearly differentiate between two different hierarchies. The processing of data is performed in hierarchical layers in the brain, but there is also a hierarchy of levels of description. I think of the first of these two as being a horizontal hierarchy, the second as being a vertical hierarchy. Processing of data in the brain is done hierarchically and recursively, meaning that small details are discovered first, and the broader picture is pieced together from multiple small details, so we move horizontally from small to large. Multiple hierarchical levels of description means that at each level we zoom out vertically and look at a bigger picture, and new concepts or behaviors emerge at each level. An emergent concept or behavior is one that can be usefully described at a higher level, but does not exist at the lower level, and I will be giving details of these at each level. This hierarchical approach for describing the brain is not new, but these proposed three levels are my way of looking at things, and I have not come across them defined like this anywhere else. Using the three levels for a possible explanation of consciousness is also not something I have come across elsewhere. The hard problem of consciousness is a term coined by the Australian philosopher David Chalmers to describe the difficulty caused by the explanatory gap between what we know about the workings of the low-level components of the brain and our own personal subjective feelings. Finally, for the introduction, just before we dive into the details of the three levels, here is an overview of them. This is a set of three levels that may help in describing what the brain does. This is not the only possible way of creating different levels, but it is the smallest and most useful set I have found. The first is neurons and synapses, the obvious lowest level processing components of the brain. A neuron is a specialized cell that is capable of receiving and sending electrical signals. A synapse, Americans usually pronounce it synapse, is the connection between two neurons that enables the sending and receiving of those signals. Next comes representative symbols that are actually networks in the brain, an obvious second level of processing in the brain because there is plenty of evidence that they exist and are used for perception and action. We will look at how the processing of data, either from outside or inside the brain, can create and maintain networks that are, to an extent, self-sustaining, so that they are activated when a particular object or concept is encountered or thought about. They are sometimes called schemas and they are representative symbols in the brain. There is a schema in your brain that represents every concept you have ever encountered, including a large and special one that represents yourself. Finally, at the third and highest level, is the combining of all these networks into a model of the world, which includes a model of the body and the processing of the brain itself. There is a lot of evidence that shows that our brains maintain this model of the world and that activation of parts of it is what causes perception, thoughts, actions, feelings, emotions, pain, and possibly consciousness. We are now looking at the first level of description. You will see that I am putting the level number in the top left as a reminder. This is an overview of the basic building blocks of the brain, first neurons and then synapses. Quite a few other cells in the body have some means of communicating via chemical means, but only neurons have an electrical signaling mechanism. All animal cells have huge numbers of internal parts and processes. The activity within any single cell has been compared to the activity within a city. The human body has around 27 trillion cells in total, not counting the non-human microbiome, and around 86 billion neurons, so only 0.25% of cells are neurons in the brain. There is another type of cell found in the brain, called glial cells, which are responsible primarily for support and housekeeping functions, although in recent years there has been evidence that they have a role in signaling and maintaining the synapse connections between neurons. The cell body is similar in size to other non-neuronal cells, just a few thousandths of a millimeter in diameter. Dendrites are what make up the tree-like structure, the main function of which is the receiving of signals from other neurons. The axons, when insulated with myelin, are the white matter of the brain. This insulation, created by glial cells, allows the signals to go much faster and also to be insulated from other influences. The total length of all the axons in one brain has been estimated to be over 500,000 kilometers, further than the distance from the Earth to the Moon. A signal generated by a neuron is referred to as an action potential, or a spike, or the neuron is said to fire or be active. A single neuron can receive signals from many hundreds or even thousands of other neurons. If the electrical voltage across the skin of the cell, called the membrane, near the start of the axon is greater than a certain threshold value, then the neuron generates a signal. The output signal from a neuron usually goes to just a few other neurons that can be some distance away from the soma. The signals are all the same strength, around 70 millivolts, and are one of the few truly digital elements in the brain. They either happen or they don't, and the signals only travel in one direction. Many people have assumed that signals from neurons form part of a code, rather like the software code running on a computer, but in fact it is nothing like that. There is no translation of signals into anything else more meaningful, and in fact the importance of neuronal signals is not that they happen at all, but their frequency. Having said this, the fundamental functionality of a neuron, which is not often highlighted, is as a coincidence detector, because, over a period of time, it sums all the inputs to make a decision. In 1873, Camillo Golgi accidentally spilt some silver nitrate on a slice of brain tissue that had been hardened with potassium dichromate, which caused only a very small number of cells to be stained black, which meant they could be much more easily identified using the simple microscopes of the time in the otherwise confusing mass of tissue. However, it was Santiago Ramón y Cajal who improved the staining method and identified, described, and drew the individual cells with their various branches. He was a good artist. Golgi was very resolute in his arguments that the brain must work as a whole network unit with cells fused with each other. Cajal was convinced that the cells he had seen through his primitive microscopes were separate, and he even guessed, correctly, that the signal in a neuron only goes in one direction down the axon. In 1906 Golgi and Cajal shared the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine. Cajal eventually was proved correct, although Golgi never fully acquiesced. But at that stage how the join between two neurons worked was not at all clear. A synapse is the junction between two neurons, normally the end of the axon of the sending neuron to the dendrites or sometimes the cell body of the receiving neuron. The incoming signals to a neuron come from the axons of many other neurons. It can be hundreds or even thousands, with many synapses on each dendrite branch, so there are trillions of synapses in the brain. Synapses can either encourage or discourage the receiving neuron to fire, because they can create either a positive or negative electrical signal. These are known as excitatory or inhibitory. A typical neuron receives many signals of both types all the time, but an overall balance of excitatory and inhibitory synapses seems to be maintained, although the mechanisms that govern this are not yet fully understood. There are various ways in which synapses can change, which means that signals between neurons change, and this is the way that memories are formed and kept. New synapses can form, old ones can be deleted, and neurons can grow new branches, both on the dendrites and on the end of the axon. The strength and/or reliability of synapses can change. The basic functionality of a synapse is to pass a signal from one neuron to another, either to encourage or to discourage the receiving neuron from raising a new signal, and to be adaptable according to usage. The gap between two neurons was first identified and named as a synapse in the 1890s, only around 10 years after neurons were found, but the gap between two neurons was not able to be seen by a microscope until 1955. And investigations into the details of how synapses work and change continues today. Charles Sherrington, who named the synapse, had earlier, from 1893, discovered inhibition generated by synapses in reflex responses in the peripheral nervous system, for example, in the knee-jerk response. There was a debate, or more of a battle really, that went on from around 1900 right up to the 1950s, as to whether synapse communication was electrical or chemical, and the two camps were named the soups and the sparks. It turned out that they were both right. There are two types of synapses, chemical and electrical, but chemical ones are far more common. One of the first people to suggest that changes to synapses are the basis of memory was the Polish neuropsychologist Jerzy Kornowski in 1948. There were debates for many years, certainly up to the 1990s, but it is now generally accepted to be true. The existence of synapses, and their strength and/or resilience are all factors, and these in turn can depend on many complicated factors such as the amount of neurotransmitter available, along with changes to proteins, channels in the membrane or even DNA. To conclude the details of level 1, the functionality of neurons and synapses that emerges at this level is as flexible coincidence detectors that have a memory to record their activity and change as required to improve their detection, and also to potentially compete with other neurons by inhibiting them. A neuron, with hundreds or even thousands of incoming synapses, can potentially respond by passing on a new signal in many millions of different circumstances. In practice, it is likely that most neurons will only be involved in a relatively small number of different detections. The memory of past activities is recorded in the changes that happen to synapses. Lateral inhibition is generated by synapse connections that have an inhibitory influence on other neurons. They discourage their activity. We are now moving up to the second level of description, taking a high-level view to see networks of neurons and their synapse connections in the brain that are representative symbols, sometimes called schemas. The proposal is that you must have a schema in your brain for every concept you have ever encountered, remembered, or thought about. In fact, there is an abundance of evidence that a network of neurons in the brain consistently becomes activated when the concept or thing it represents is perceived or thought about. The activation is self-sustaining for at least a period of time, presumably because of loops of excitatory links within the network, as illustrated in this simplistic diagram. We will look at how these schemas could be created and maintained by the known functionality of neurons and synapses. Networks in the brain were first proposed in 1890 by the famous American psychologist William James, in his book, The Principles of Psychology, and have been extensively discussed and investigated since. They have been given various names: cell assembly, neural assembly, engram, gnostic units, maps, images, invariant representations, mental representations, and so on. I prefer the name schema and tend to call them symbol schemas for precision, because some psychologists use the term schema in a more general way. The Canadian neurosurgeon, Wilder Penfield, pioneered the use of electrodes for probing the brains of patients with severe intractable epilepsy from the early 1950s with the aim of finding the source of the seizures and cutting out the small piece of brain responsible without causing any significant damage. These patients were under local anesthetic, but fully conscious, so that they could report what they experienced. There are no pain receptors in the brain. He found that, in some parts of the brain, causing neurons to fire could have some very surprising effects. Some places evoked very particular memories or feelings, such as a color, a specific sound or song, or a memory of a specific event, either real or imagined. Some were events that the patient thought they had forgotten, and some felt like a seizure about to start. The stimulation of some places made the patient move, or try to move, in various ways, even though they did not feel they had initiated the move. These places in the brain were very specific and reproducible. This was the first real evidence of the physical existence of schemas. Brain scans have confirmed the existence of areas in the brain that represent different concepts. A study published in 2016 recorded the brains of 7 people in an fMRI machine, while a story was read out, and scans of their brains were analyzed to try to highlight isolated areas that are more active than others when particular words were heard. The data gathered was not very detailed, because the scans only measure the oxygen usage, not neuron firing specifically. The colors are coded for different categories of words. This crowded diagram is of the whole cortex spread out, showing the different areas where concepts appear to be represented, and there does appear to be quite a lot of consistency between the different people. The second picture is a small extract. Penfield's original experiments used large electrodes that probably caused many thousands or even millions of neurons to fire. More recent experiments use very tiny wires so that only one, or at least a small number of neurons are activated. Also, since the 1980s, multiple tiny wires are sometimes inserted and left in patients' brains for some days or weeks for the purposes of investigating the source of their epileptic seizures. The data gathered can be used to try to understand when neurons fired in relationship to each other within a cell assembly or schema. In 2005, one of these investigations was widely publicized as identifying what was described as a Jennifer Aniston neuron. There were also ones for Halle Berry and Bill Clinton. However, other similar names had been used previously, such as grandmother cells, cardinal cells, and name cells. It is not difficult to get real-time evidence for the existence and use of schemas. You may have seen this before. Which way is this mask rotating? This is one of many so-called visual illusions that show that our view of reality is only based on a model, and therefore not always totally correct. There is another illusion on this slide with repeated words that you may not have spotted, because your prediction model assumes the text is correct. The conclusion is that we do not perceive the world as it is, but only via schemas. We cannot perceive something until we have a model of it. We are unaware of these models or the way we use them, which is a puzzle in itself and one I hope to answer later. I have covered some of the evidence that points to the existence of symbol schemas in the brain, and I have given an overview of the basic functionality of neurons and synapses, but how does the one get created from the other? The visual processing system in mammals has been studied for many years and is now well understood. Many connections are laid down early in the development of a young child, even before birth, presumably driven by DNA, and are not built from experience. If this were not the case, a newborn baby would not be able to recognize and respond to a face, for example. American David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel, who was born in Sweden, worked on the visual processing of cats in the 1950s onwards, and received a Nobel Prize in 1981 for showing how neurons in a hierarchical structure, what I am calling the horizontal hierarchy, respond first to small details such as lines, curves, and edges, with larger features processed higher up the hierarchy. It is worth noting that there are about 1 million separate input streams from the two eyes, with 800 million neurons in the whole of the visual processing areas. The processing is recursive, in the sense that the processing done at each level is the same, and the information stored at each level is more compressed and more abstracted at each level. This is why, for example, you just see a table, or a frisbee, unless your attention is drawn to it specifically, you don't notice other details about it. Are there structures in the brain that could provide this type of hierarchical, recursive processing? Yes, in the neocortex, the outside layer of the brain that is particularly well developed in human brains compared to other animals. The relative size of the neocortex compared to other mammals is the only known unique attributes of the human brain. The human neocortex has increased in size by almost 300% over the last 3 million years of human evolution, since the arrival of the Homo genus. These neocortical columns all have forward and backward excitatory connections as well as lateral inhibitory connections. In 1978, the American neuroscientist Vernon Mountcastle proposed that these millions of columns have a common function, and he called them unit modules. The implication was that they were general-purpose processing units that could be used for many different things, depending on what they were connected to. The American computer scientist and neuroscientist Jeff Hawkins, who helped develop the Palm Pilot, one of the first handheld computers, is one who has followed this up with proposals for modeling the cortical columns and founded a company which aims to model the brain in software. He believes that cortical columns can model anything that is input to them, and also map the location of it using grid cells. There is plenty of evidence for common functionality in the brain. One part of the brain can take over the functions of others. For example, in a blind person, the area that is used for visual processing in a sighted person is used for hearing or touch. This is a very simplified diagram of seeing a segment of a red frisbee and how the incoming visual signals are processed by a set of hierarchical identical units that spot coincidences and have feedback, each consisting of 3 pseudoneurons. This is the start of the horizontal hierarchy. The boxes are pseudoneurons because they only have 2 inputs and 1 output, so many of these might be part of the same real neuron. The neurons on the far right eventually become part of a schema that represents the frisbee, as we will see in a minute. Each set of 3 neurons could be considered to be a common processing unit, so A, B and C are a unit, D, E, and F are another, and then C, F, and G are also one. This is a good example because it is simple and relatively easy to understand, but poor because it is not strictly true, as already indicated, because quite a few of these connections are laid down before birth, at least in the visual system. The aim is that this diagram can be extended to cover the processing of data from any senses, external as well as internal. The hierarchy of processing units is capable of compressing the data, finding patterns, and abstracting the important information. Black and red arrowed lines indicate synapse connections that may cause the target neurons to raise an action potential, because of the coincidence of 2 firing at the same time, or nearly the same time. These connections will be strengthened as part of a memory, making them more likely to fire next time. Blue lines are inhibitory signals sent to other neurons with similar functions, meaning there is a competition going on. In fact, nearly all neurons have some inhibitory connections, so there is a multi-level competition going on for all data processing. Black lines indicate signals being processed inwards. The end result is the selection of the most important signals, and the extraction of the gist, which can be called compression or abstraction. This is the basis of attention, which we will cover later. Red lines are other synapse connections backwards or outwards that can also make future firing more likely and can act as predictors as well as what are often called reinstatements, being a memory of the sensory input relating to the creation or update of a schema. It had been known for many years that connections going back towards the incoming data sources were just as numerous as those coming in, but it wasn't until the 1990s that the reasons and uses for these started to be understood. This is another highly simplified diagram showing the combination of sense data from seeing and throwing a frisbee contributing to the creation or update of a schema, which is a symbol. Many hierarchical levels of processing are required to create these links, but learning and prediction can cut down the amount, as indicated by the longer black and red arrows. Activation, which is multiple self-sustaining firing of the schema, then represents the perception of, or thinking about, a frisbee, which may or may not be consciously perceived. The schema is a symbol, it represents a frisbee in the brain, and to the owner of the brain it is a frisbee, in the sense that the only way a frisbee can be known about is via this schema. The lower half of this diagram indicates signals coming back from the wrist and hand that are associated with throwing a frisbee, but of course signals must have been sent to initiate this action, and it is part of this schema that can be used to do this, but in the reverse direction. This gives a clue to the formation of what is probably the most important schema in your brain, the schema of yourself. A model in the brain of the self is something that only a small number of writers have discussed in detail, but it seems to me to be a required extension to our model of the outside world and our interaction with it. The Portuguese-born neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, who is currently professor of psychology, philosophy, and neurology at the University of Southern California, has written at length about the subject in several books and papers. I propose that the self-schema is built in the same way as the other schemas by the processing of coincidences, and that 3 or more layers can usefully be considered separately. The first layer is what Damasio calls the protoself, and is the brain's model of the internal state of the body, which is built from the brain's internal interactions with the body. The name interoception is used for the sense of the internal state of the body and its maintenance via various nerve and chemical routes into the brain, and it can be considered to be like one of our 5 normal senses, except that nearly all of the interactions are never consciously available. The brain controls all these things, and this must start well before birth. All engineers know that the best way to control a complex thing is to model it, even if that model is simplistic, and the hierarchical processing I have briefly described for external things would work just as well for internal control. Damasio points out that, although we do not have conscious access, we do often have basic feelings about the state of our body. So, for example, if my heart is racing, it is either because I have been exerting myself too much, or I'm in a panic, or I feel unwell. The second layer is proprioception, the brain's model of the body and its movement. Again, this can be thought of like an external sense, and is clearly connected with balance. Most people have probably seen the apparently random movements of arms and legs by a baby, usually called motor babbling, just like later vocal babbling, which is the baby's brain basically sending signals out at random to see what happens. The coincidence is then a connection between the issued command and the perceived move. The data that comes back about the position of the limb can be matched with the command that was issued. Once the first two layers are established to create a basic model of the self, further layers can be built on top which can best be described as properties or qualities of the self, things that can be attached to the self. These include identity, such as personality, name, birthday, and so on, ownership, agency, which is the ability to initiate and control actions, and episodic or autobiographical memories. This explains why I can't remember anything from before I was about 3 or 4 years old. My self-schema was not fully built, and therefore I could make no long-lasting episodic memories. There is quite a bit of easily understood evidence for the self-schema. The rubber hand illusion is when a person can be fooled into thinking that an artificial hand belongs to them. A subject is positioned with their left hand hidden behind a screen out of sight, and a lifelike rubber left hand is in front of them. The experimenters stroke both the subject's hidden left hand and the visible rubber hand with a paintbrush. If the two hands are stroked synchronously and in the same direction, the subjects begin to experience the rubber hand as their own. When asked to use their right hand to point to their left hand, most of the time they point toward the rubber hand. If the real and rubber hands are stroked in different directions or at different times, the subjects do not experience the rubber hand as their own. Phantom limb pain is when a person who has had a limb amputated continues to feel pain from the missing limb. Most people experience some sensations in the amputated limb, but an unfortunate small percentage experience painful phantom limb sensations, which can happen despite there being no nerve signals coming from the stump. So-called out-of-body experience is the illusion of owning either a part of a body or an entire body other than one's own, or the illusion that one's body is not in the correct place, perhaps floating above the bed. It can be induced experimentally by manipulating the visual perspective of the subject and also supplying visual and sensory signals which correlate to the subject's body. The easiest way of doing it now is using virtual reality, but of course it can happen with certain drugs. We've probably all hit an elbow on a door frame once in a while. These examples are all pieces of evidence that we use a model of our bodies and perceive our bodies via this model, because there are occasions where it can go wrong. There is one more element, the processes of the brain itself, that is an important part of the self-schema, as we shall see shortly. My introspective understanding of my own attention is that I can consciously focus my thoughts on anything within reach of my senses, or on a memory in my brain. In fact, research has shown that the process of attention is not like that at all. Attention is actually a multi-level competition between various inputs that results in a filtering out of unimportant things and a prioritization of the most important thing to be dealt with at any one moment in time. The reason that one thing has to be prioritized, and therefore why we can only have attention on one thing at a time, is that the brain needs to make one decisive decision on an action. It would be no use if one part of the brain decided that the legs should run away but at the same time another part of the brain decided that the arms should fight. The paradox of Buridan's ass is relevant here. This is when an animal standing exactly halfway between two sources of food dies of hunger in the middle because it cannot decide which one to go for. This process is explained by the horizontal hierarchical processing of data already described as part of this level 2. We are very rarely aware of any of the processing going on, and sometimes we are not even aware of the final decision. I suspect we have all done things, including driving a car, and later realized we can remember nothing about it afterwards, and research has confirmed that the process of attention is still happening and a decision is being made, even without it being conscious. However, it has also been shown that reaction times are slower than if something is conscious. The question then to be answered is, why are we only conscious of the end result of this process? This is my attempt to diagram the real process of attention. Sense data is coming in from many sources via many senses all the time. Some of these will activate schemas, others will not, but the process of attention is at work in all of the streams all of the time. Only one source makes it through to the top of this data processing hierarchy to become the conscious subject of attention at any one time. The self schema on the right-hand side is self-referential in the sense that it describes itself having this process of attention. It has a schema of attention, as described on the next slide. Michael Graziano, who is professor of psychology and neuroscience at Princeton, proposed the attention schema theory around 2011 as a possible theory of consciousness. The theory says that the brain creates a model or schema of the process of attention, and it is this model that we perceive and not the real underlying process of attention. This is the source of self-awareness because the model says we are aware of something, and then we can be aware of that awareness, and so on. However, Graziano defines consciousness to be the same as self-awareness, which, as we will see shortly, I do not think is completely true, although self-awareness is required for consciousness. His theory has not had very much publicity, and tends to be categorized as an illusionist theory, mainly because Graziano himself describes the theory as if the brain is being fooled into thinking it is self-aware, and that the concept of the self is not a real thing. I think this is an unfortunate categorization, because the concept of myself in the brain is in fact more real to me than the concept of a frisbee, for example, and I think that self-awareness is a real perception. But Graziano also proposes that this is perhaps why we feel that our awareness or consciousness is separate from our bodies and brains, or even that consciousness is ineffable and immortal. I think the theory is a good explanation of why our knowledge of attention is nowhere near fully correct, but I also think that the same can apply to other brain processes such as perception, action, thinking, memory, agency, and free will. Our introspective knowledge of all of these functions is limited to what our self-schema can be aware of. I also think that these schemas of internal brain processes can all be created and updated using the same hierarchical processing that I have described for perceiving external objects, so it is valid to talk about our perception of ourselves and our brain processes. Here is a summary of the features of the second level of description. It starts with the creation of networks of neurons and their synapse connections in the brain that are representative symbols. These networks are self-sustaining when activated. There are also inhibitory connections between different networks, so there is an element of competition. There are many emergent behaviors at this level. Competition, compression or abstraction, and selection all come about from the action of many neurons and the memory capability of synapses. The process of attention is built from these elements. Prediction comes from connections that go back towards the source of the data. Memories are created by the joining of schemas with new connections. The self-schema is also created at this level, and models of the processing of the brain emerge as well, including attention, which creates self-awareness. Moving up to the third and highest level of description, the model of the world in my brain is made up of all the schemas and their interconnections, which are symbols for everything that I have ever perceived, imagined, or otherwise come across, including myself, my body and the processes of my brain, and all the connections between them. Mathematical descriptions have been applied at this level. The model is nonlinear, and is kept in a state that is close to chaos, with what are generally called strange attractors. The activation of one schema is semistable, but it will never last too long, and the activation of others will eventually stop its activation. This state is created and maintained by the balance of excitatory and inhibitory connections, which varies during the day, but is reset by sleep. The strength of excitatory connections builds up during the day to bolster new connections that are made. This is the way new memories are laid down. But this means it is more difficult, or requires more energy, to move from one schema being activated to another. This is why thinking is more difficult when you are tired. It is not just lack of energy, but also that it is more difficult to initiate a change in attention. The ultimate outcome of too much excitation in the brain is an epileptic fit, a condition caused by chemical and connection imbalance in at least part of the brain, and it is known that a lack of sleep can eventually cause fits. Dreams are at least partly a result of the reactivation of schemas in order to balance out the connections. Sleep is used for all sorts of other things as well, for example, the consolidation of memories, and the clearance of toxins from the brain. In 1867, the German physicist Hermann von Helmholtz said that the brain creates models of objects in the outside world, that these models are symbols that represent things in the real world, and that the model is built from our sensing of the world. These ideas were mostly forgotten until the 1960s. The British psychologist Richard Gregory published several papers in the 1960s and 1970s that took up some of the ideas of Helmholtz. Like Helmholtz, he described a number of illusions of the senses, categorized them, and then put forward his ideas on a predictive brain. He described in some detail the advantages of the brain having a model of the world and using prediction to come to a conclusion about perceptions, rather than being purely reactive. Some philosophers, such as Kenneth Craik and Philip Johnson Laird, have also published ideas about models and the use of prediction in the brain. Since then, the idea has grown in influence, and particularly in the last 20 years or so with the popularity of predictive processing, which requires a model of the world to be maintained in the brain, but says nothing about how it is created or updated. Predictive processing basically proposes that the brain is a prediction engine, and that the whole aim of perception and action is to resolve prediction errors. This is an interesting way of looking at it, but I think it is a bit one-sided. Here is a good example of the illusions that Helmholtz and Gregory were referring to, that shows that we do not necessarily see what is actually there, but only what our brain interprets should be there. In this case, the brain accounts for the shadow cast by the cylinder and assumes that the checkered squares are only two colors, as they always are. Here is the proof that the two squares are actually the same color as each other. The conclusion is that we do not perceive the world as it is, but only via the model. We cannot perceive something until we have a model of it. The model of the world in your brain consists of many thousands of schemas, one for each concept or thing you have ever come across, whether real or fictitious, concrete or abstract. The strength and reliability of connections between them, both excitatory and inhibitory, govern how your thoughts and dreams move from one concept to another, and these can change at any time because of usage, or lack of usage. There are many different behaviors that emerge at this level. Prediction at the level of schemas enables us to predict what we might be sensing based on previously known connections. Schema-level memory is our memory of connections between concepts, which is the entirety of our memory. Perception and action are, in a sense, opposites of each other. Perception is driven by something we perceive outside the model, whereas action is the model driving something outside the model. A lot of life is based on this loop in repeat mode. Thinking and dreaming are the changes in activations of the various schemas, some of which become conscious and some of which do not. Sleep, although not created by the model, is a requirement to reset the balance between excitatory and inhibitory connections and hence to allow efficient thinking and attention. In the mathematics of chaos theory, the process of activations can be called a winnerless competition between attractors. That is the end of the third and final level of description. We now move on to some concluding speculations about how consciousness is generated within this hierarchy. If you ask 10 different people to define consciousness, you will probably get 10 different answers. I define consciousness by my introspection of what enables me to know that I exist from moment to moment. All the different features of consciousness depend on self-awareness. For me to be conscious of something, I need self-awareness, otherwise the consciousness has no connection to me. Attention is what I can be aware of from moment to moment. Memory is what I need in order to know that my consciousness is continuous. Feeling is what I need to be sure I have consciousness. I would not have any qualia or pain or emotions if I didn't have self-awareness. This is a three-step logical argument that shows where consciousness must be. Most scientists agree that self-awareness is a prerequisite for consciousness. If you are not self-aware, you cannot be aware of what you are attending to, or have feelings or memories. Self-awareness requires a model of the self, and therefore it must be the model of the self that is self-referential. Therefore, what we call consciousness can only be generated within a model of the self. My final proposal is therefore that my consciousness, and therefore what I call I, or what some people might call their soul, is actually within the model or schema of myself. It is a high-level emergent feature, at what I call level 3, and can only be aware of what is within itself or connected to itself at the same level. This can explain a number of things. Why I think of my consciousness as being separate from my brain, fixed, ineffable, or even immortal. Why myself did not fully exist until I was around 3 years old, and therefore I have no episodic memories before then. Why most things that go on in my brain are unconscious or subconscious. I have no knowledge of them and can get no knowledge of them from introspection. How feelings come about. A feeling is simply what it is to have certain things connected to myself via attention. Why I think I have free will, or how, because from the point of view of being in my self-schema, I do have free will. I have come across only a handful of scientific writers who have come close to the same conclusion, and those who do, say that the self is an illusion or a hallucination. I find this odd, because I know that my self-schema is more important, and more real, to me than any other schema, because I deal with myself in every conscious moment, and it is what gives me existence. This final slide is a brief summary of what I have covered in this presentation in 3 points. I have proposed 3 levels of description of the brain, each of which have new features or behaviors that emerge at each level that are not necessarily apparent at the lower levels. The representative symbols in my brain, that I call symbol schemas, are created and updated by the basic functionality of neurons and synapses. The special symbol that represents the self is created in exactly the same way, and self-awareness arises because it describes the process of attention and is self-referential. My consciousness is therefore created within this model, it becomes sentient, and has all aspects of my personality and memories attached to it. Feelings are simply what it feels like to be a model having that particular structure at that time, so when my self-schema connects, via the process of attention, to a schema representing a feeling, then it feels like something. That is the end of this presentation. For more details, visit hierarchicalbrain.com.